stick more ants in an experiment, as you stick more and more ants into the experiment, smaller and smaller fraction of them are actually walking around. So that's like, I view that as like the capacity utilization of capital.
Ants. I should find a guest about ants and make a convoluted intro with really corny music. I'm brilliant! Ant societies have division of labor, communication between individuals, and the ability to solve complex problems. These parallels with human societies have long been an inspiration and a subject of study. Many human cultures make use of ants. This includes in cuisines and medications. Some species are valued in their role as biological pest control agents. Their ability to exploit resources may also bring them into conflict with humans. They can damage crops, invade buildings. Some species, such as the red imported fire ant of South America, are regarded as an invasive species in other parts of the world, establishing themselves in areas where they have been introduced accidentally. Welcome back to another episode of Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Daniel Friedman. Daniel got his Ph.D. in Ecology and Evolution at Stanford University, studying the neurophysiology of collective behavior in ants.
Well, welcome to another episode of Steve and Friends. I'm Daniel Sanderson, and I'm your host today. I'm very excited about today's guest, Daniel Friedman. We've actually met in another podcast series some time ago. So yes, he is an ant expert. His postdoc was involved with the observation of ants and ant colonies. But by no means is this the extent of his research and knowledge. He is a complexity thinker, and I'm very excited to bring him into the conversation with Steve. And I hope you guys all enjoy. So, with no further ado, I bring Daniel into the studio as well as Steve.
Greetings. Thanks for having me.
Hi, guys. Hi, guys. So I wanted to start off with something that we were talking about backstage, and it was the preamble. It was the E.O. Wilson preamble. And the way I can kind of summarize this is that in the field of ethology, or the observation of nature as it applies to ants and ant colonies, you have some very specific insights at a high level within the discipline itself. And quite possibly the way I interpret it is a division between an interpretation, an economic or non-economic interpretation. So could you maybe summarize and bring that up again, what you were talking about in the pre-show?
Awesome. Well, I have a lot of questions, such as what constitutes economic outside of the kinds of financializations and processes that we humans engage in. So that's definitely something to compare with. And thanks again for having me. There's certainly a lot to explore with ants and complex systems. I'll just give a little background on my context, how I came to be thinking about these questions and the kinds of experiences that led to me being able to talk about them with you. And then there will be many angles to explore with ants and economics. So in graduate school from 2014 to 2019 at Stanford University, I was working with Professor Deborah Gordon. And Professor Gordon has had a long-term field observation study for over 30 years in the US Southwest in Arizona. And at this field site, there are many species of ants living there, but the most visible and prominent is a species called Pogonomyrmex barbatus. It's the red harvester ant. They're pretty large red ants, and they have a large disc mound, a lot of pebbles scattered around. They go out of the colony, they forage, they grab seeds and other little detritus, bring it back. And so it's a very visible and, as it turns out, long-lived ant species, in the sense that the queen can live for 30 years and the workers are continually turning over. So it's a very fascinating ant species to study. And at that long-term field site, Professor Gordon had been studying how variation in the environment, here describing basically the weather patterns at the site, were associated with differences amongst colonies in their foraging behavior. And that kind of work, as you pointed out, it's ethological. It's related to observing animal behavior in context, and it involves a lot of ant watching. I was interested to continue and extend that work by integrating it with some recently developed molecular techniques that were increasingly becoming accessible outside of the traditional model organisms like the fruit fly, the nematode, and so on. So I spent a lot of graduate school in Arizona watching ants, but also collecting ants, freezing them in liquid nitrogen, doing molecular analyses, looking at their gene expression, and also manipulating their neurophysiology with pharmacology. So spent a lot of time watching the ants and doing analysis on their behavior, as well as measuring different molecular components of them and manipulating their physiology to understand how it would change their behavior. So that's kind of the work I've been involved in. And all along the way, while looking at the colony and while reflecting on it outside of the fields. Do you hear, or is it okay?
I want to focus on 2 points: behavior of humans versus ants, and I'll make a statement that says the behavior of ants are more deterministic, and humans are much more of a variable. So, as you make comparisons between the observation of ants and ant colonies, and you make observations between humans and human activities, how do you start to draw safe distinctions between the two systems without getting yourself in trouble as a scientist?
All right. So the question is about determinism and about similarities and differences with human and ant behavior. But just to check, you can hear me. It's all okay?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Professor Gordon wrote a great paper in 1992 called Wittgenstein and Ant Watching. And that paper really analyzed the space of ant watching. And I think there's a few stages in the observation process that apply to ants, but also apply to how we think about humans, and also reflect on some interesting aspects of human economics. So let's just say that we're looking on the ground and we see an ant pulling a seed. The first thing that we might say is that ant is foraging. So describing the behavior, naming the behavior. And that's already one stage of naming. The next step, sometimes from identifying a behavior, is people go on to identify and associate that behavior as almost an identity of the ant. It's not just that that ant is foraging, it is a forager. And so that can happen subliminally, the way that we name a behavior and tag it as an essence of something, from that person is running to that person is a runner. So we're used to jobs being careers and positions in humans. And sometimes the dynamics of an ant colony, surprise, surprise, don't align with career ladders of human societies. And so there's actually a tremendous legacy of human or humanized ways of thinking about task and work that have woven themselves into the ways that we describe ant work. For example, division of labor. Well, that's a term that comes back to Adam Smith. And some of the rationales that are provided for why division of labor supports material success, for example, that skills are acquired progressively by working in a given capacity as a bread maker or the candlestick maker, some of those kinds of arguments may or may not hold. An ant may or may not become a more skilled forager by going on repeated foraging runs. And so the ways that division of labor and also the notion of caste, which is widely used, they have actually, they flow from the ways that humans view ourselves into the ways that we view ants. And so it's always this question of how can we look at the ants and nature more generally with fresh eyes and bring what we do know to the table, but not overly constrain what it is that they're doing, which ultimately transcends everything we know about humans because it's simply different.
Okay, so yeah, the use of Adam Smith with that terminology of division of labor is really interesting. I'm going to go back to the ancient Greeks and Plato and Socrates to describe the shoemaker as integral to a thriving community, right? You kind of know your place. But it's described as the art of, and that really aligns with what you're talking about, that you actually incrementally improve your skill set over time. And so if I understood you correctly, the ants that doesn't necessarily happen. They just go out and they do. So that's really interesting, like an instant ontology. It's like, I'm just there, right? It's not like they're projecting themselves through history and or through into the future, which is part of our abstract ability to see ourselves into the future, which is a feature or is a bug. It's a feature. But if we're looking at the success of a species by the number of species, we've got ant colonies at 10,000 and humans at 1. So they might be winning that. they might be winning that charge. Would this be a fair description of, what I heard you explain, at least in terms of the, the art of and the skill building set that humans have and the ability to forward look into the future?
Well, for ants, every feature is a bug, and that's not a problem. Certainly, human material and cumulative culture has enabled skill building to progress to an incredible level. One important difference with the ants, again, kind of contrasting with a human career skill building ladder, this is known in ants as temporal polyethism, which is a way to describe how task and performance of different behaviors changes through time. This is broadly the case. There are certainly some exceptions, but when the ant is a young worker, it performs work inside of the colony, inside the nest, like nursing. When it's a middle-aged worker, it does work like trash pickup and architecture. And then in its latter adulthood, it engages in work outside of the colony, like foraging. And so it's not that when it's born, it's assigned into the nursing career, into the architecture career, into the foraging career, but actually they all move through all of the tasks in a probabilistic way. That's quite distinct from the pick a lane approach that specialization often requires in humans.
So you said, like, is it a high degree of probability, like 99% of ants go through that conscription, almost like, to me, that's what I imagined when you said that. It's like there's a military organization. I know I'm projecting, but they progress through that ladder essentially, and they kind of go through all of the roles as they progress in age, right? So would you say that that's like a fair analogy to say it's somewhat like a military kind of structure?
I think the beauty of complex systems is
Mm-hmm.
every metaphor, every simile is valid and incomplete. So yes, it has similarities to different high reliability organizations. We might also think about it like skin cells emerging from the stem cell niche and then progressing through some developmental stages before they're sloughed off. Because the nestmates, again, speaking sort of broadly across ant species, they have no reproductive capacity. So the entire workforce can be understood as the soma, or the non-reproductive body of the colony. And so you have the queen, or really just a reproductive diploid, reproductive female insect, laying eggs that are nursed by other nestmates. And then those nestmates go on to grow up, differentiate, perform tasks, and slough off. Their mortar coil is shed. And so it is kind of like a treadmill with new biomass being generated and pupa and larvae growing. And then they just progress through this stereotypical developmental trajectory.
Wow, very fascinating. So tell me if I'm correct on this fact, this tidbit that I picked up from who knows where, that the biomass of ants and humans are roughly the same on this planet. Is that is that true? I mean, I don't know where I picked that up from, but
People have done some recent analyses. I'll pull up the paper if we need, but they're in the same magnitude. They're both vast.
I think
They're
that's good
both
enough.
vast.
Yeah, I think that's good enough. Okay, I'd like to kind of move. Well, first of all, I'd like to give a plug and a shout out to Steve's Patreon group and also his on Twitter. If you're watching this on Twitter, it's also available on YouTube. But please engage, like, and share. I wanted to actually bring this conversation into from ants and ant colonies on one hand, and we've got human and human activity on another hand. And I want to introduce a third piece into that, and weather systems. I'm hesitant to talk about bring climate into it without just simply looking at weather systems as a complex system. And so, what like just initially, what kind of parallels would you draw between the complexity of ant colonies versus weather systems? And would you say that those systems are closer in description than the complexity of human and human interaction? And it may be just a null hypothesis here, but I mean, how would you approach that if I was to draw a closer similarity of ants to weather systems versus I guess like human activity? Would you say that's a fair thing, or is it's just too abstract of a comparison to draw?
All right, let us weave the triple helix with ants, humants, and the weather systems. I'll share something I observed a lot in the field in Arizona. And we were watching their foraging behavior during the monsoon season. So during the late summer, where some days it's beautiful, it's prime foraging time, good humidity, a lot of seeds on the ground. Other times it's very dry. So the cost of foraging in energy and water loss is high. And other days there are rainstorms, thunderstorms, and really intense monsoon rains, at which point the foragers out in the field could be lost. That incurs a large cost for the colony, and also the colony itself could be flooded. And so the behavior that sometimes we'd observe would be, we show up at the field in the morning, there are some ominous clouds on the horizon, and some colonies would be packing the entrance of their nest with pebbles. That's a behavior that prevents flooding, but obviously it also prevents foraging for the day. So it's a de-risking strategy. Now, no nestmate knows how many seeds the colony has, how many seeds are out there, what is the cost benefit on the bioenergetics and the water loss, what's the likelihood of a storm. There's so many factors that would go into making this informed decision around to forage or not to forage at the colony level. And I think there's a lot of analogies there with in economics, like no one knows how much a pencil costs or how it should be made. These sort of distributed decisions about the collective economy, in a sense, it reflects that in these complex systems, no individual subunit has the awareness necessarily to take all the factors in, integrate them, crunch the numbers, and come to some sort of reasoned conclusion. Rather, we have evolution and ecology that are creating these little packets of individuality, like a nestmate, that through their own local interactions are just making their decisions. So both humans and ants exhibit a lot more agency and sovereignty in their local environment, in the sense that they're active and they're life forms that have to maintain their non-equilibrium status, while weather patterns are dissipative largely. There's some sort of buildup of precipitation and then the rain falls. There's some sort of pressure differential and then the wind flows. So there are certainly similarities and differences, but the question made me really think about that moment at which some colonies at the field site were packing their nest entrance and others were foraging that day. So it's high risk. If others are packing up, you might have increased foraging access, but that's a riskier strategy. It's like maybe investing in a market when other people are keeping their capital on the sideline.
So the question is for Steve. Do you see that the way Daniel has described that risk behavior and what emerges out of the risk environment response for ants? And so the example you used is for the loss of foraging for a day in order to protect flooding into a colony. Would you see this as a way to fundamentally describe how markets function in terms of, you talk about like a sorting function within the markets. It's kind of self-sorts itself. And so I'm just wondering if you could unpack that a little bit in terms of, did you see any similarities with the way risk is described within a system like that? His mic is on, but
the ants are home, but no one's foraging.
He built the pebbles up too high, so he's Steve's going to learn sign language, I think, and then it's just not happening for him today. So I know you're not a specialist, Daniel, in market economies, but what's your intuition on it, right? I mean, what do you, if the same question was posed to you, what's your intuition on that?
Okay, I'll put on my Steve hat with only knowing a little bit. Risk, broadly, correct me if I'm wrong, we can associate with uncertainty with respect to outcomes conditioned upon what actions we take. A risky behavior is one where a given action may have a wide distribution of outcomes, whereas a non-risky behavior is one where, conditioned upon the action we select, we know exactly what the outcome is going to be. So investing, deployment of capital is fundamentally risky. There's informational uncertainty in financial markets. The ant colony has skin in the game, exoskeleton in the game, whereas in financialized markets, we have capital in the game. And in both cases, we are acting under partial information. So part of the risk is fundamental. Part of the risk is based upon the fact that we only have partial information and incomplete ability to even integrate the information we have. You mentioned a sorting function. So what is that?
Oh, it's something that I say a lot when I'm writing. It's and maybe it harkens back to personally for me, and this is how I view it. And this is a very unique perspective. So I look at a sorting function as how, from a philosopher's standpoint, I have a foundation for aesthetics, and so it's a biological substrate for aesthetics, and it's our ability to sort things into categories, right? And so in I guess it's like I would say it would be like agent-based organization into specific areas. And what I find really fascinating about how you've been able to break this down is that you are. It feels to me like your response and the interaction that I'm gleaming from our conversation is you instantly challenge almost every fundamental assumption that we have, right? I mean, it's our language, and then maybe this is, a lead back into Deborah's paper from Wittgenstein, is that every label that we use in language limits our ability to see the reality of the world, right? And it's fascinating. Like I'm simultaneously agreeing with you, but not knowing where to put my foot in the quicksand, right? And it's interesting. And so going back to this aesthetic that I consider the sorting function, it's how do you move things into categories and make predictive interpretations of the world, right? This is, that fundamentally is the sorting function.
I'll add one note there on the economic difference. So something that kind of presents itself is to what extent the optimization or really just the outcomes are being considered within a generation versus across generations. So the harvester ants in the Southwest, at the population level, they might have some colonies that are more gung-ho on a dry day, and some are more likely to pack it up on a rainy day, and others are varying in all aspects of their behavior. And so that's like a portfolio of strategies that is over evolutionary time bet hedging against the volatility of the climate and the changes that are happening over different time scales. So among generations, what comes to happen through selection is you see collective behaviors and nestmates with certain responsivities that are adaptive. In contrast, in human economics, or for a given firm, we're interested in the success of that firm. We have like a one-shot opportunity, and that's very different than the task that the colony is adapted towards. So sure, every colony, if we think of it as a firm, is looking to ensure and secure its own success and reproduction. But the level at which evolution occurs is at the population of colonies. And so it'd be almost the difference between a competitive business ecosystem. Every firm was looking to maintain its own advantage and eradicate others, versus everybody being at the population scale looking to shape the distribution for most adaptivity. That's a quite different and potentially more collaborative environment that may or may not be compatible with different layers of human economics.
Yeah, that's very well said, Dan. I look at it and I think that there's an ideological, and this is kind of a negative, pejorative sort of word, especially within scientific or scientists. But to me, I'm looking at this thinking that there's a reality to our global network of making all prosperity for the world as oh, there we got Steve back here. Okay, we definitely hear your mic. So I'm gonna ease Steve into this, and I'm gonna actually put up a tweet that came from an organization that Daniel's in. And then Ty, if you could put on the caption. Actually, I got it here. So Dan's involved with the ISSS, and it's the International Society for Systems Sciences. And I think we'll kind of move the conversation in that direction and away from ants per se at this point. But I want to show a tweet here that came from the society, and it had a really interesting graphic. And I'm hoping, Dan, you could kind of step us through this. I could give my interpretation, but I might blunder it a little bit. What are you gleaming from this in terms of where do you start? How do you describe this graphic? And what story does it tell you?
All right. Well, being involved in education and knowledge engineering at ISSS, but not creator of this graphic. How about you give the first pass? And then if Steve is around and listening, can go second, and we can go from there.
Okay, awesome. So I'm automatically drawn to the couple, the farmers in the field there, and world economy, the generator. So I'm quickly equivocating this to a GDP. I see the right hand side, the nature piece, and the bidirectional arrows. That just simply makes sense. Power with a lump sum of money and capital. I'm a little bit confused why it would be power if it's a lump of money, but it's okay. Investments in MPP, growing power to start things. So this seems to me that I'm making an assumption that it's very human, labor-driven model here, and moving back between power, money, capital in order to generate world economy, and then both of those feeding back into a freedom piece means that it's a delicate balance of trying to keep those three things in check in order to maximize freedom. And again, you got nature kind of as that check and balance on the right there. So yeah, that's kind of how I interpret that. Steve, what do you see on this graphic here?
You mean that particular graphic? Potential future. He called them afraid to say. I don't. But that fulfilling life after growth. I think our problem is dramatic overextension of growth. So but it doesn't do anything for me, I'm afraid to say, that particular graphic.
Okay. So then, with the comment with the title of fulfilling life after growth, they're painting a picture that we've had the steady growth now. And in the show, though, Steve,
apologies for
there's been a lot of dialogue on from people listening saying, what happens after growth? And with this, on second thought, would this have any impact on that? Can you give any insight into what a graphic would look like in a degrowth situation in comparison to what we're looking at?
I'll give a thought if again it's a little audio issue. So returning to the population as the cohort of evolution. So the ant colony's developmental trajectory has been honed. All right. Thank you, Steve. Another time potentially, since the internet seems a little bit off. The developmental trajectory of a colony is tuned for its adaptivity, and they may engage in local oversourcing of resources, but that results in a local and less global resource depletion. Whereas I think part of the unprecedented nature of the growth overshoot that Steve mentioned and that previous guests have also mentioned is like at the population level, the cohorts of firms, the human population scale, we are in unprecedented territory with respect to energy use and environmental modification. So to return to the image, the piece that stood out to me was the only missing arrowhead is from freedom back to power. Now, one could certainly question whether any of these three circles are imperatives or what should be optimized for, but it's very interesting framing that power can be converted to freedom, but the only way that power could be regenerated, or whatever it is on the bottom left, the number of seeds that the colony has, only through the economics itself can it be regenerated. But certainly this question of how far overshot are things and relative to what null hypothesis and what is the critical path towards some type of regenerative future or sustainable path, those are such important questions, and I don't know.
Okay, so I want you to define null hypothesis within this context, because I understand that it kind of goes to oblivion. There's nothing conclusive in it, is the way I interpret that. But I didn't quite make the connection in that response as to how null hypothesis comes in.
Sure. Overshoot is over what? Things are just the way they are. One can certainly point to a graph where things escalated over the last 5, 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000 years and say that looks like a sharp turn up. But to say that that has overshot something is implicitly embodying a null hypothesis, which is, well, what wouldn't be an overshoot? What if we said we're undershooting? We should be accelerating faster in this respect. So overshoot, undershoot, just it is what it is. And the question is, what is the critical path moving forward?
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Again, it's the choice of language and that limits you. Okay. Okay. So why don't you tell us a little bit, the audience, a little bit about the ISSS and what you guys are up to and where you see the ISSS going in the next year and beyond. Why don't you tell us about that wonderful organization?
Cool. Well, ISSS is a systems science organization, and it's been around for decades. It's hosted some of the most central proceedings and annual publications of systems science. And where things are going for systems science, patterns across systems rightfully could and should be applied across different sectors. So I really hope that systems thinking, people have many ways to talk about it. And since the discussion includes languages other than English, I'm kind of a pluralist with respect to what it is called. Thinking about the patterns across different systems is going to be at the heart of finding transferable approaches and practices that work, and being able to talk about the way that the ant colony packing its nest is like us deciding to engage in a venture or not, or being able to talk about the way that a nestmate's interactions with its local environment relate to its foraging behavior, connecting that to human interactions with the local environment, seeing that how it connects to individual and collective behavior. Those are examples of systems thinking. We're highlighting processes and patterns, analogies, archetypes, and different resonances amongst different systems. And system science is where we learn that practice, that art and science. So I hope that the ISSS can continue to make their decades of archives more accessible and indexed and applicable, so that these treasures can become better seen in a modern light, and that new generations of learners and practitioners can walk through those halls and treat those previous contributions just like we would at a library where work has been done. We're not going to engage with all of the work, but certainly some of it is part of our learning journey. And then we leave the library and we go on to, maybe some of us write books that make it back to the library, but a vast number of people use what they've learned and take it forward and push forward the practice of not just research and science, but also systems application.
Application, that's the key. You said something, you brought up the word archetype, and so that seems to be a wild card in the well-defined explanation, or that wonderful explanation you gave in archetypes. Really interesting, because to put that into context is really interesting. And a function of an archetype is, I mean, that's complexity in itself, right? I mean, that's a really interesting approach. Would you care to comment a little bit about archetypes in complexity and how to define them?
Very interesting area. Yes, archetype is often used in a Jungian or in a psychological context. Maybe we can think of it on a landscape where a raindrop that falls on one side of a mountain goes out to the west coast, and the raindrop that falls on the other side of the mountain follows all the way out to the east coast. Those are like two archetypes that it can follow. They're two canalized paths, such that slight differences in initial conditions can lead to these tremendous differences in outcomes. That's also called chaos. And those differences in outcome are supported by basically the landscape's structure, the structure of the attractor that those two different raindrops fall down. And those pathways can be seen as archetypal, not necessarily stereotypical, but they are like pathways that things follow through. And I see a comment in the chat: the best way to define anything is by simplicity. And that's one of the most fun and long-lived discussions. Are we talking about complexity, or are we talking about simplicity? Because we're talking about the simple processes by which nestmates perceive, engage in cognition, and act. So in a sense, it's simple, it's interpretable. There's just a few set of rules that we might apply in an agent-based simulation, but the outcomes are complex. Other times the outcomes are simple, but we still might study that using systems and complexity approaches. So is it complexity? Is it simplicity? Is it complicity? Is it simplexity? It is what it is. And we just have fun. And the field of systems and complexity is just like a clearinghouse and a space for those who want to learn and apply along those lines.
Okay. So now I'm going to throw a curveball at you, because I mean, I know you're not a physicist, but I have to. Yes, exactly. You may knock this out of the park, or you might say, I pass. Okay. So I love the raindrop analogy, right? A change in initial conditions, and then that was, as you described, chaos. And it's the difference between the raindrop falling on the west coast or the east coast, or position A, position B, right? I want you to put in your mind the double slit experiment and how would I basically really nutshell summarize this? And I'll say that there is in the observation of the double slit experiment just an inherent probability to the fundamental nature of the universe, right? As in terms of the photon ending up on position A or position B on the phosphorus screen. So that's not chaos. That follows a distribution pattern of somewhat similar to like a bell curve. So I just wondering what your thoughts are on that. If I've said anything that has like critically not described it properly, then please correct it. But that's kind of my interpretation of the double slit experiment. What are you familiar with it, and what do you think about what I just said?
All right, I'll speak to this question of quantum mechanics. Let's imagine that rather than a electron emission device, we had a colony entrance. And ants are going to be streaming out of the colony, and they're going to be returning to the colony, like maybe they're foraging in the Southwest US, who knows. And we put up a screen around the colony so that there are two ways that we can see the nestmates enter and exit. And these kinds of experiments have actually been done, which is very interesting. Now, there's two cases. We're either going to observe, like with a camera top down, or we're not going to observe. If we observe that environment with the top-down camera, then we will see, yes, ant number 4 went out this one. Ant number 5 went out that entrance. So we know that ants are particulate, and when we observe it, we see them acting like bodied particles going through either one slit or the other. So the observed case, we see something that looks more like one or the other. But let's just say we scatter the seeds all over, and then we don't observe, and we come back later. We might find that the way that the seeds have been modified, or the way that the pheromones have been deposited, is probabilistic. We don't know which ant or how many ants went out of each slit, but we have this sort of probability distribution across possible pasts. Now, how it actually plays out with the electrons and the phosphorus, that's real physics. I think that's an interesting question. Would love to hear more from somebody who's thought about it. But I've always found it really fascinating that even at this observable meso scale, the same question of observing or not observing, we still see this kind of particle wave duality emerging as a function of our engagement with the experiments without appealing to any spooky behavior.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, and within circles of I mean, have you told that story to people within your circle? I mean, that's quite interesting to me. I'm like, let's make it a big YouTube video, and because there's a lot of geeky physics stuff out there, but that's pretty interesting.
There are qualms, I'm sure. It's not exactly the physics double slit experiments, but it's an intuition pump. It gets us thinking about particles and distributions, and yeah, it's fun to explore.
Oh, intuition pump. Speaking of Daniel Dennett, did you have you read that book, Intuition?
Oh,
Pump?
yes.
And it sounds by your affirmation and your head nodding that you agree with that. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah. While it is not an exhaustive compendium of intuition pumps, different people, it's kind of like our cognitive toolkit. We have different practices we might engage in that help us build intuition and think about things differently, whether by sharpening the way we're thinking about it, looking for alternatives, and so on. The book really resonated with me because it, if we wanted to pump water, we would want to know what kinds of pumps existed. Maybe sometimes you can use like a bicycle pump. Maybe other times you can use a Roman aqueduct. Maybe other times you need some other type of pump that does other things or has some other characteristic. Well, if we're interested in information flows and information dynamics, then tools for thought and intuition pumps are like those practices and infrastructure that help us move the information and knowledge where we'd like to see it go. So I think it plays a really relevant role in what we do when we think, especially alone and together.
Yeah, very, very eloquent in your responses and very concise, Daniel. I have to say that's very interesting. Now, to use a very suitable metaphor with the pumps, priming the pumps, and when you create an experiment, say a social science experiment, you want to be careful as a scientist, social scientist. I don't know if they're the same thing. Anyways, sorry, I'll probably get in trouble for that. But you don't want to prime the participants with contaminating information, right? And so it's an interesting description and apt analogy to look at pumps, and the nature of some pumps require priming. They require a certain amount of background information, and in a philosophical sense, like a dialectic sense, the conversation or the act of us interchanging information back and forth results in something, completely different, right? And so I kind of look at that as a dialectic priming conversation, which functions very much differently than an agent-based model in isolation. So what are your thoughts about priming people with certain information to ignite those pumps? Can you maybe just describe that a little bit?
Well, it's a very important question from the earliest larval stages of childhood on through professionalism, how we provide contexts and enabling structures for people to learn and develop and be in their flow state and also contribute in an aligned way. And how do we provide top-down priors in kind of a Bayesian sense, or just cues or pumps or priming? How do we provide enough context so that individuals who are coming from different places, have different preferences, etc., can basically be stimulated and engaged to do whatever it is to be done without over constraining or under constraining, leading to unnecessary ambiguity? So very rich question. And then what it kind of made me think about was, in businesses, sometimes there's like this 0 to 1 mindset. Like, we're going to start something fresh. We're going to have 0 businesses, and then now we're going to make a new business. That's the 0 to 1 creation from nothing perspective. Of course, it's not actually nothing, but it is called a 0 to 1, or you're making something new. You're making like a new thing. Whereas in biology, life is part of not just a network of interactions, but an unbroken chain of previous life. Colonies don't go 0 to 1. It's not like there's some kind of construction set that builds the colony and sets up the queen and the brood in a way where then it can run by itself.
Yeah.
Colonies come from other colonies, and that chain takes us all the way back. And so maybe how can we think about human social and economic systems, respecting that there are truly differences that do emerge. There are kind of step functions or quantum-like jumps, but at the same time, everything comes from other previous processes. Maybe that would reduce perceived discontinuities and help us think about how we're never like not going to prime. That's not an option, and it's not even preferable if it were an option. So then how do we prime, and how do we carry things forward?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, well, we've got 7 minutes left in the show, and I want to ask one more question. Okay, and then we'll move you backstage, and then basically I'll close out the show. So the question is, I've been very, it'll lead up to a question. I have this problem of priming the guest. So I've been very impressed with you, Daniel, in this kind of a second sort of conversation. You're very articulate, and I could say that the word that comes to mind is very analytical, but you're very deliberate with your speech, and your definitions and your explanations are wonderful. So I want to thank you for that, for being, such a wonderful guest. But I see a problem that, again, whether it's a feature or a bug, I don't know, but your ability to get to first principles that are far lower or than most people can even imagine are is really interesting, because I nod my head and I go, I think Daniel's absolutely right. But maybe speak a little bit about the real world and having to kind of go down the rabbit hole and participate in Alice in Wonderland and still be a scientist, right? Like, although we would love to go out and take that perspective and go down to first principles that actually presuppose, I think, 90% of our language, how do you participate in language that you know is counterproductive, is antithetical with progress? How do you do that? How do you approach those kinds of problems when the substrate is so, like, we live in an epiphenomenal projection, basically? I mean, that's the assumption that I'm trying to prime you with. What do you think about that? Making it practical, pragmatic.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, projected or otherwise. Every feature is a bug, as mentioned earlier. How do we make this pragmatic? I can give a several minute thought, but ultimately this is something that will be enacted and it's participatory. So it's not for anyone, let alone myself, to say, and I'm not even personally interested in making those kinds of final claims. What it made me think of, though, is we live in a polycentric world. Just like no nestmate knows the adaptive foraging, no human knows the adaptive strategy for the collective. We might have strong conviction about different things, but none of us have that eagle eye view and infinite compute opportunity. And so we interact. Mm-hmm. And when we interact, especially in an online setting, it's often through symbols and language. So when I'm on the receiving end, without going too deep down the rabbit hole, I want to understand what people are intending, reading between the lines, listening between the words, listen to the intention in light of the context. And if I hear something and I think, well, that's not what I would say, it's like, okay, because I didn't say it. Somebody different with a different life and different intentionality said it. So people say different things in this polycentric world that we live in. And then on the action side, that's the only thing I can control, is what I say and what I think. So I choose to just speak neutrally and in a way that feels aligned with how I see the topic. I'm sure there's a lot more pragmatism to be unpacked, and it's always a skill and a question about how we communicate, how we practice. But overall, I almost want to go deeper than first principles. The 0th principle is the field work and observing in the field. That's pre-first principle. And then when people are having a conversation that's very second principles, like, well, that forager did this and that nurse did that. Well, that's where we have the Wittgenstein and ant watching. Oh, it's not that it is a forager. You're naming it a forager because you assigned an identity to it because you called that behavior foraging. So you can unpack that, but in the stillness, even amidst activity, there's actually just pure unlabeled pragmatism. And I think that transcends language.
Wow, that's great. I mean, that's wonderful. It's like, I want to go before first principles. I want to go to 0 principles, 0th principles. I think you had said that's really wonderful. Okay, I want to thank everybody. That's the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody for watching this episode of Steve and Friends. Steve, unfortunately, just had one of these situations where he's had a poor internet signal, so he wasn't able to participate in the conversation very much today. We did get a few grunts out of him, so perhaps we might see Ty put together another montage grunts and silent speech. That would probably be in character for Ty. I want to get everybody to, as much as possible, to like, subscribe, and tune in next week. Next week's guest is Phil Dobby, and for those of you that know Phil Dobby, know the name of Phil Dobby, he is somebody that does a weekly podcast with Steve Keen, and that is published on his Patreon page. And yeah, so tune in next week, and thanks for being our guests, and we'll see you next week on Steve and Friends.
We did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it, so fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning.